Hi, everybody. This is Dr. K from Holistic Minds. I am proud and honored to be introducing Dr. Stephanie Seneff to you. She's an MIT senior researcher and just brilliant, brilliant person who is really paving the way for us to understand how certain toxic chemicals, especially glyphosates, are impacting us. And why I invited her and asked her to join us is because I think this information is so absolutely critical for you all to hear. And I'm just so privileged to know that Dr. Seneff thinks enough to be joining us and to take her time to share. So Dr. Seneff, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
What caught your attention about the glyphosates? Because you've published over 35 articles on it, and I mean, it seems to be one of your big areas of focus.
I'm totally focused on glyphosate at this point. I'm fascinated with the molecule. It is so interesting from a biological standpoint, the way it works and how it causes problems, which is just enormous in terms of the effects on all life on Earth. Very terrifying thought. I got into it really by accident because I was looking for the cause of autism. I saw the rates going up exponentially. This was like 12 years ago when I started looking at autism. It took me 5 years before I even thought of glyphosate. And it was just because I happened to be at a conference where Professor Don Huber was speaking, and he gave a 2-hour presentation on glyphosate. I didn't know the word when I walked in. And I was at the edge of my seat. And by the time it was done, I was convinced I had found the answer. And I was right. I mean, it was just an epiphany for me because I knew a lot about autism at that point. And he was explaining how glyphosate works and what it does. And it just filled in all the gaps that I was frustrated not being able to find the chemical that was causing these problems, and it just fit beautifully.
And, with some people, I joke and I say, if we could have done a better job finding a chemical to harm ourselves, we probably couldn't have done it. And glyphosate seems to be that one thing that we were not very smart about inventing.
Yes, it's incredible. And the thing is, because it's insidious and it's cumulative, it doesn't knock you over the head. So you don't notice you're being poisoned until it's a slow accumulation of toxin throughout your body. And eventually things start caving, and you start getting various problems that are too numerous to mention as far as all the different effects that it has on physiology. It's incredible. It's an incredible molecule. And its effect is very unique, actually. And it's a synthetic molecule. Nothing in life ever makes this molecule. I think it's too dangerous is why, it's really very, very destructive. But in this insidious, slow way that you don't necessarily realize this is the thing that's causing your problems.
Now our audience, at least some of them, have heard of the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma cases that have been tried, and the discussion around that. But what do you? I mean, I know you said there's a lot of different things it does, but what worries you most about glyphosates and what it does to the human body?
It's an analog of glycine. That's what makes it so bad. It's an amino acid. So if it's an amino acid, it sort of adopts all the amino acid biology, picks up on it, and it gets taken up actively on amino acid channels. The biology acts as if it's a normal thing, but it's not. And the really critical thing, and this is a theory which Anthony Samso first gave me this idea, and once I caught onto it, I couldn't resist. It was just so perfect. Again, it was a second epiphany, actually. And that was several years after I'd started looking at glyphosate, maybe 2 or 3 years before we figured this out. Anthony and I have done several papers together. And he suggested that it might be substituting for glycine during protein synthesis. And this was like December of 2013 or something. And I have been, that has been a complete obsession of mine since then, because you can find so many papers on the internet that talk about the role of glycine in different proteins and what happens if glycine is mutated. You get some horrible diseases with a single mutation of a glycine in a particular protein. So you can find all the proteins that have sensitive glycine residues and places where glyphosate is likely to substitute, because it doesn't substitute everywhere. It depends upon some biophysical constraints. It's a bigger molecule. It's a glycine. It's a complete glycine molecule. Glyphosate is, except that it has extra material stuck onto its nitrogen atom. So it fools the system. And when the protein is being assembled according to the DNA code, it grabs glyphosate by mistake and puts it where glycine should be. This is what I think is happening. And it beautifully explains EPSP synthase. EPSP synthase is the protein that Monsanto claims is the target in the plants. It's the thing that kills all plants, is that glyphosate disrupts that enzyme. and it disrupts it by occupying the space where the substrate should go, which is phosphoenol pyruvate, PEP. So there's a shape that's fit around the PEP molecule by the protein, and glyphosate goes into that place where PEP should be. And what they claim is that it substitutes for PEP, but actually it substitutes for glycine, which is in the actual protein. So the enzyme has a glycine residue, highly conserved across most species, and that glycine gets swapped out for glyphosate. And glyphosate's methylphosphonyl group occupies the space where PEP should go, and therefore the substrate no longer fits. That's how it messes up that enzyme. And that enzyme happens to be incredibly important in the shikimate pathway. The shikimate pathway happens to be incredibly important for all plants and for many microbes. So it does a real number on them just for that one protein. But the fact is that there are many other proteins, including human proteins, that have a very similar situation where they have a highly conserved glycine residue that wants to bind to a phosphate. PEP has the phosphate that glyphosate is occupying that space. So you can find many other proteins that have exactly that same setup. And then you can predict what would happen if glyphosate substitutes, and what would happen is exactly what we're seeing in terms of all these diseases that are going up dramatically exactly in step with glyphosate. It's a beautiful, beautiful theory.
Now, you said so many important things, and I think for our audience that's not familiar with this discussion, some of this probably flew right over their head.
I know, most people don't have the biology background, unfortunately.
Well, you touched on the microbes, and
Yes.
I know that you've done some studies, and there's a lot of studies out there talking about how glyphosate, I guess maybe we should backtrack. Glyphosate is basically this herbicide or herbicide that the farmers use to, kill weeds and basically make their plants resistant to weeds so they grow better. And they also use it to finish off certain crops like wheat, right?
Right, oats, wheat, barley, and legumes, chickpeas and garbanzo beans. So they turn out to have very high levels of glyphosate, by the way. The ones that are sprayed right before harvest are coming up with higher levels than the ones that are GMO. So these are non-GMO crops sprayed, like the wheat and the legumes, sprayed right before harvest.
Really?
Higher levels, significantly higher levels are showing up in the foods that are derived from those crops than in the GMO food. So when a person sees a non-GMO and thinks that's a healthy choice, it's not necessarily the case.
Wow. So it's becoming integrated into the food we eat based on the spraying that these farmers are doing to basically increase their yield,
yes.
right?
Yes.
And this chemical gets into the plants, it gets into the wheat, the barley, the legumes, other things, because it's also in the water supply, so forth. And once this chemical then gets into our body by the food we eat, one of the things that you mentioned is that it disrupts the microbes.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and that's the first thing that we identified. Anthony and I wrote our first paper together. That was my first paper on glyphosate, about the gut microbiome and the effect that glyphosate has on it, because the microbes have the shikimate pathway, which glyphosate famously disrupts. And they use that pathway to produce the aromatic amino acids, tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. Those are coding amino acids. They go into the protein. So if they're deficient, you're going to have a problem with protein synthesis. But worse than that, those are also precursors to all kinds of important biological molecules. A lot of the B vitamins, like folate, and niacin. Niacin and folate both come out of that pathway. And I think other vitamins as well. And then the neurotransmitters, serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, epinephrine, and also the skin tanning agent melanin, all of them come out of that shikimate pathway. So when that pathway is disrupted in the gut microbes, we don't have the pathway, so we can't make those aromatic amino acids. They're called essential for that reason. We have to either get them in our diet or our microbes make them for us using a pathway that becomes defective in the presence of glyphosate. So we get deficiencies in all of those things. And I think deficiencies in serotonin end up causing obesity and aggressive behavior and depression. I mean, all these kinds of emotional issues that we see.
Yeah, because serotonin is our feel-good chemical. And,
yes.
Part of what I see in a lot of the kids I work with, the children with severe behavioral problems, is they have all kinds of neurochemical imbalances.
Yes.
A lot of that has to do with these kinds of chemistry imbalances, especially
absolutely.
with serotonin.
Yeah, and another interesting thing is that the way the microbes end up becoming imbalanced, it preferentially kills beneficial bacteria like bifidobacteria and lactobacillus, which are really essential in the early stages of life. They become, fewer of them provides an opportunity for the pathogens to grow. Clostridia in particular have been singled out as becoming problematic in autism, probably in some of your patients as well.
Mm-hmm.
And Clostridia I've heard that they produce a toxin or multiple toxins that actually suppress the conversion of dopamine to epinephrine. I find that very, very interesting because a lot of these kids have these EpiPens on hand all the time, right? These EpiPens to inject epinephrine. I'm wondering whether a blockage in the conversion from dopamine to epinephrine is causing their body not to be able to produce enough of their own, plus building up too much dopamine, which makes you be this kind of hyper state that you see in ADHD with too much dopamine. So they've got this, really big imbalance in their hormones. There's also a problem with glutamate. A very, very interesting story about glutamate, glutamine, and GABA that I'm seeing. Excess glutamate I'm seeing certainly associated with autism. And I'm beginning to really understand how that's happening. And that has to do with another feature of glyphosate, which is chelating minerals. And it chelates manganese, making it unavailable. Manganese is an important mineral for a few of the enzymes. They depend upon manganese to work. And one of the enzymes that depends on manganese is glutamine synthase, which converts glutamate to glutamine. So when that enzyme gets blocked, glutamate piles up and glutamine becomes deficient.
Wow.
And so that's what you see in autism. You see exactly that.
Wow. So, I mean, this is incredible. This is really incredible. I would love to kind of depact or whatever what you just said, because you just hit on so many things that our families need to know about, because most of these kids that I see have MTHFR defects.
Yes.
I've stopped testing them. I pretty much automatically presume, and when I do test them, pretty much every time there's a big mutation. So these kids have these mutations. They need extra folate, but their bacteria that are producing the folate are getting killed off by the glyphosates. So it causes disruption there. The good bacteria that these kids need to balance their immune system. And one of the things I see in these children is their immune systems are going haywire, and they're reacting to all kinds of strange things that they shouldn't. Well, part of that immune response is because the lactobacilli and the bifidobacters, the good bacteria, are getting killed off by this compound. So now there's like a double whammy. You touched on the tryptophan. So we already touched on the fact that these kids have serotonin issues. What's interesting is I'd say about 30% of these kids also have thyroid imbalances. And tyrosine is ultimately needed to make free T3 and T4.
That's right. Tyrosine, the thyroid hormone is another thing that comes out of that shikimate pathway. That's right.
So these kids also end up getting thyroid problems, but the thyroid problems are probably related to the gut bacteria not producing things. And, I loved what you touched on with the Clostridium, because I'd say about half our families, we end up doing these, fancy stool tests, and about 30% of the kids actually have Clostridium.
Yeah, there you go.
Clostridium. And I love what you touched on, because so many people focus on, well, let's kill the bad bugs, let's kill the bad bugs. And for me, it's like, no, you've got to understand what caused the bad bugs to get out of control.
Yeah, it'll just come right back if you keep on eating the poison. So you really have to get rid of the glyphosate. That's the only way to heal, I feel. And that's very difficult to do in the modern environment, because it's so pervasive in our environment. It's very, very difficult to avoid. Even people who are eating, I get email from parents all the time who say, we're just eating 90% organic, and I tested my son and he's got high glyphosate levels in his urine. I don't know where it's coming from. It's like really, really sad when I see that.
Well, I want to get to that, because that's a whole other level of discussion that I want families to hear. But one of the other things that you touched on, so we touched on how glyphosates create a royal mess in the intestinal tract. So if there was one thing that the family could do, or let's turn it around. If there was one thing we would do that would really mess up the intestinal tract of these children at the gut bacteria level, at other levels, it would be the glyphosates.
Yes.
One of the things that I've read from some of your research is that glyphosate, through direct and indirect actions, also causes leaky gut.
Yes,
which then causes the food intolerances and so forth. Can you help us understand how that happens?
Yeah, that's very interesting, because it's actually worse than that, because it disrupts the digestive enzymes. Anthony Samsel actually ordered from a lab, from a pig, sourced from a pig. He ordered trypsin, pepsin, and lipase. These are digestive enzymes that digest proteins and fats that are produced by the pancreas. And he tested them for glyphosate, and all three of them came out with high levels of glyphosate in them. And these are enzymes that people take, because they have enzyme problems. And they have enzyme problems because glyphosate's getting into those enzymes and preventing them from working properly. The pancreas is getting hit really hard by glyphosate. We see also the, type 1 diabetes. We have an epidemic in that right now, and that's also due to glyphosate attacking the beta cells and destroying them.
Wow.
And so you end up with an inability to digest the proteins, and especially gluten, which is already difficult to digest. You get these peptide fragments that are undigested protein that then irritate the gut and cause this reaction, which actually opens up the gut barrier and creates the leaky gut. So it's the undigested proteins as a consequence of the digestive enzymes being disrupted by glyphosate end up inducing the leaky gut, and then the undigested proteins get into general circulation. That's when you start to get an immune response. The immune cells are on fire trying to gather up these undigested proteins and help try to clear them. And they end up with all these antibodies that then turn up matching your own tissues because of something called molecular mimicry. And you can end up attacking your thyroid and getting Hashimoto's thyroiditis.
I wish, not that we want anyone to end up with thyroiditis. What I find is a lot of these kids are also attacking their own neurotissue, because one immune reaction leads to another, and next thing you know, they're reacting to gut bacteria, which then causes molecular mimicry. And then this is one of the things that I believe is underlying these massive surges of pandas that we're seeing, or PANS, yes, where these kids are attacking their own neurotissue.
Absolutely. That's one of the big things that ends up matching. The myelin basic protein, for example, has peptide sequences in it that match even peptide sequences in viruses. So you get a reaction to the virus that then carries over. I actually, my studies on glyphosate, what it would do to certain proteins has led me to believe that it disrupts the innate immune system. It weakens the innate immune system. And so as a consequence, the adaptive immune system has to be more aggressive. And you end up, there's sort of two branches, the T1, T2, both of them become overactive. T1 gives you all the inflammation, and T2 gives you all the autoantibodies. So you end up with autoimmune disease and inflammatory disorders, rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and multiple sclerosis. These things are all due to both the autoimmune reaction and the inflammatory reaction, which are all components of the adaptive immune system, which has to get into high gear because the innate immune system is broken by glyphosate.
How does that happen? How does it kind of disable? I know it's way complicated.
I'll try to make it simple, but I've identified several proteins. One of them is the cationic antimicrobial peptides, which are quite interesting, that are produced by the immune cells of the innate immune system. And they bind to the virus's bacteria to sort of shine a light on them so that the immune cells can easily see them and clear them. And those peptides are positively charged, and they have glycine in them. And they bind to the negatively charged membrane of the bacteria. So anything that binds to something negatively charged, particularly phosphate and sulfate, I've identified those two. Phosphate is the one, as I mentioned, in the PEP, in the sugarmate pathway, the one protein that I have as a model. I look for other proteins that have a similar situation, and I can identify those as being especially susceptible to glyphosate. And so if this peptide isn't working, then it's basically the immune system's way to put out the fire is defective. It's like it doesn't have any water in its hose, you could say. And it's the same thing with there's these things that have stalks that are called collagen-like stalk that are on these particular proteins that they actually act like a vacuum cleaner. They go out and they find, and not just the microbes, but even like cellular debris, various, like the endotoxin that's released by the microbes. These special proteins gather them up, and then they bring them home and stick them onto the macrophages so they can clear them. And the process of sticking them onto the macrophages is a place where, again, you see that situation that's going to be susceptible to glyphosate substitution.
Wow. So really, the immune system, in a way, is becoming disabled. It's hobbled.
Yeah, absolutely hobbled. Yeah, I feel it's just a catastrophe. And the more glyphosate you have, the bigger your problem is. It's proportional to how much there is in your food.
Do you think some of this may be related to some of these chronic infections that children and adults are now kind of suffering from?
Absolutely. Because you basically have, I feel you have kind of three choices. Once your innate immune system is in trouble because of glyphosate, you can either go the inflammatory route. So inflammation will help you to kill the microbes. And of course, that causes all kinds of collateral damage. And that's things like rheumatoid arthritis or gout, and I think all these issues we're having with plantar fasciitis, I mean, all these different back problems, all these different inflammatory issues that people are having with a lot of chronic pain. Collagen is the most common molecule protein in the body. We have a huge amount of collagen in our body. That's in the joints, in the bones, in the skin, that's the glue that holds everything together. Collagen has long sequences that have every third amino acid is a glycine. There's a whole pattern, GXY, 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 GXY. So those glycines have a tremendous opportunity for glyphosate substitution. There's a lot of diseases, genetic diseases, where there's substitutions of individual glycines in collagen that cause disease.
Wow. Wow.
And so I think we're just getting simulated mutations, really. When the glyphosate substitutes for glycine, it messes up the way collagen folds. Collagen builds this beautiful triple helix structure that has really super properties in terms of tensile strength and flexibility. That gets ruined when you start putting glyphosate molecules in there randomly.
Wow.
And so you get the collagen isn't working right. You have joint problems, you have back problems, neck problems, knee pain. We have all this knee surgery, hip replacement therapy. I mean, all these things I think are a consequence of glyphosate getting into the collagen.
So for some of I used to work with adults in the past, and I would have quite a few fibromyalgia patients.
Yes.
What was interesting is a lot of them would get better when they were on gluten-free diet. So it wasn't just their inflammation at the gut level was improving. It was probably because their glyphosate levels were coming down. Finally, the glycine was actually substituting back in. So their tissue was actually getting repaired at the cellular amino acid level. And it wasn't just the gluten.
Right. I absolutely agree. Yes.
Wow. One of the other things that, I mean, for most of our families, they're probably already blown away with just these factors that are impacting their children in their own health. And, I'm probably, as parents are hearing this, parents are like, oh my God, yeah, I've got that neck pain and I've always had this pain and no one's been able to explain why. One of the things I would love for you to touch on is what I see in probably at least 30, maybe 40% of these children is a metabolic disorder where either the mitochondria are disrupted, and that's usually what I see because they respond really well to CoQ10, or there's other areas. But with the mitochondria in particular, so the cellular energy production, the energy production plants, why would parents need to be worried about glyphosates if their kids are weak? So these are the kids that can't run, they can't, they can't even climb up on the treatment table. They try to play soccer for 2 minutes, they tire out. And one of the things that I see and why I'm bringing this up is it's not just their muscle that gets shot. Their mental energy is shot, their adrenal glands are shot, their other organs are not working well. And I've seen the metabolic effect just hit every single part of the body. Why would parents need to be worried about glyphosates and how that affects the mitochondria and just energy production in the human being as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff with the way it affects the mitochondria. And again, it has to do with glycine substitution in critical proteins. There's one, a cytochrome C oxidase. It has a critical, the place where it binds oxygen, and that's the one that's going to use the oxygen and use it to produce energy. And the place where it binds oxygen has a critical, absolutely conserved glycine residue. And if you substitute glyphosate there, you're not going to be able to handle oxygen correctly. So you're going to end up it's a superoxide actually that it's trying to handle. Superoxide, of course, is highly reactive and very, very important in the mitochondria to actually produce the ATP that they produce, the energy. So the superoxide can't quite fit correctly when there's glyphosate substitution, which is going to cause it to just go out into the general area and cause damage. So you get basically an increase in reactive oxygen species, which are going to damage the local tissues, including damage the mitochondria, introduce DNA mutations in the mitochondria because of this oxidative damage, because the enzyme's not able to manage the oxygen correctly.
Wow.
Yeah, and they've shown in multiple studies, including with humans, they've shown that glyphosate causes mitochondrial DNA mutations, or at least DNA damage that's indicative of a precursor to cancer.
Well, do you think that's why there's this concern for the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, because it seems to be specifically tied to exposure in a work environment, where you're actually applying the glyphosate yourself to the weeds rather than eating it in the food.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that is somehow a direct hit like if it gets on your skin and gets into your body through that method.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be a unique, I don't know that the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is necessarily connected to glyphosate. Sorry, we've got a workman in there doing a little banging. To glyphosate in the food so much as glyphosate in the work environment.
Gotcha.
Which is interesting, and I don't actually have a good explanation for why that is. But that is, again, I mean, it's the immune cells, it's the white blood cells getting messed up because of chronic exposure to glyphosate, and then getting damaged, eventually getting mutations, and then getting cancer, turning into a cancerous cell.
So just to recap, basically what you shared with us is these little tiny energy production power plants, they ultimately take fuel and they take oxygen and they spit out the equivalent of human electricity, which is the ATP.
Yes.
And when glyphosate gets into these little energy production power plants, what it does is it basically causes them to kind of overheat and go a little haywire. They spill out these noxious chemicals, which actually end up causing them damage. So
exactly. They're not able to handle it correctly. They're normally able to handle oxygen in a very smart way, but this gets messed up by the glyphosate. There's another really, really interesting protein that I've been looking at lately, called PEPCK, phosphoenolpyruvate. This talking is it? PEPCK, phosphoenolpyruvate carboxykinase.
Mm-hmm.
A very interesting protein that's in the mitochondria. There's a mitochondrial version of it, and then there's a non-mitochondrial version. And the mitochondrial version actually controls the insulin release from the pancreatic beta cells. And this particular enzyme has a very perfect match to the way glyphosate messes up EPSP synthase. So I'm predicting that it would be especially susceptible to glyphosate. And if that enzyme is defective, it can explain a whole bunch of different diseases that I'm seeing on the rise, including type 1 diabetes, fatty liver disease, which glyphosate has been shown to cause fatty liver disease at very small concentrations in studies on rats. And that is a consequence of the disruption of this PEPCK, because this is actually in the liver. It's a critical protein for gluconeogenesis, which is the production of sugar from protein or from fats. The conversion of protein and fats into sugar. And in the what it happens when it messes up in the mitochondria is it backs up the whole mitochondrial cycle gets backed up with metabolites that don't get cleared, and it gets kind of choked up with all these things, and then the mitochondria can't work as well. They can't do as many cycles because they've got all this extra stuff they can't clear because it's blocked from that pathway, just like the situation with the shikimate pathway. It's kind of the equivalent. I think it's the human equivalent of EPSP synthase in the shikimate pathway is this PEPCK in the mitochondria, backing them up and preventing them things from flowing through. And one thing really, really interesting is that a consequence is that oxaloacetate builds up. And oxaloacetate actually is used by the fungi, and they convert it into oxalate. And the oxalate, that's really a toxic form of the fungi, is the ones that produce a lot of oxalate. And so you end up with end up with fungus overgrowth, high oxalate, and oxalate is a nasty thing because it causes kidney stones, and it also can get into your joints and cause joint pain and whatnot. Oxalate crystals, calcium oxalate crystals, have become a major problem. Autistic kids have high levels of oxalate in their blood, and they have the fungus infection.
It's so funny that you say this, because it's not just autistic kids. In these kids, probably about 25%, at least the kids that I check, have really high level of oxalates, like really high levels. They're not autistic, but they probably have levels similar to a lot of the autistic children.
That's very interesting. And do they have a fungus infection at the same time?
some of them do, and some don't.
Uh-huh. Because I
But
imagine that other things could convert oxaloacetate to oxalate as well, because you basically when you block a pathway, then the thing that goes into that pathway builds up, and then it has to go someplace else. So some other pathway takes it someplace else, and that's how you end up with oxalate instead of PEP.
mhm.
And the oxalate then becomes a problem. Oxalate also ends up causing you to flush sulfate. So if there's high oxalate in the kidneys lose sulfate. They ship the sulfate out, and the oxalate outcompetes sulfate for return into the circulation.
Wow.
The sulfate gets lost. And that's another thing you see with the autistic kids. They have sulfate in their urine, but they have deficient sulfate in their body. Systemic deficiency of sulfate. Yeah, that's why they can't be because sulfate is essential for detoxification, especially for mercury. So if you've got a lot of mercury in your teeth and you're taking a lot of glyphosate, then you're going to have the mercury is going to be a lot more toxic than it would otherwise be.
So it's like the glyphosates mess up one thing, which then messes up another, and then the oxalates come out, and then the oxalates actually end up causing a whole set of issues. We actually got into this discussion with this brilliant gal, Sterling Hill.
I love Sterling. I find her overwhelming, and I can imagine people sometimes find me that way, but I understand when I listen to her what I might sometimes sound like. Yeah,
so Sterling is actually one of the first people that got me to understand oxalates, and I have to say that at least 1 in 5 of these poor children that I work with have a problem with oxalates.
Yeah,
so
that's very, very interesting, because I see it theoretically. I don't actually see. I'm not a clinician, so I don't get to see these people, but I hear about it from people like you, and it makes me gratified to know that I'm on the right track, but it's also quite terrifying. That same protein being disrupted can cause hypoglycemia in infants, and we're seeing that infants. In fact, I think it's connected to sudden death syndrome, sudden death, because if that PEPCK is blocked and gluconeogenesis isn't working, when the infant first starts sleeping through the night, they use up all the food. They got nursed, then went to bed, and then they slept for many hours. Their sugar in their blood drops to 0, and their system that's supposed to bring it back from the fats is not working, and so they end up in a coma because of hypoglycemia.
Wow. But I hate to say this, I wish it was just the newborns. I mean, it's horrific what's happening to them, and I mean, as a father, I would never ever want to imagine what that horrific picture is like. But probably 30 to 40% of the kids that we have actually have problems with hypoglycemia. They crash their blood sugar all the time. And because they get this massive adrenaline surge, they go from being okay to going crazy. Like they can't function in school. They're ADD, ADHD, because they're constantly using adrenaline to get their blood sugar back up. These are also some of the kids that we see that wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, kind of like on the dot, between 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock, they wake up, they're wired. It takes them an hour to go back to sleep. And that's also the adrenaline, because they drop their blood sugar.
That's so fascinating. So that continues right on into later life. It's not just in infancy that you're seeing that. That's so fascinating. I did not know that. I mean, that's really interesting to hear, because that's got to be that PEPCK. I mean, I got really excited when I started digging into that particular protein, because it seems to get in the way in all these different diseases that are all fitting with the glyphosate. They're going up. We're having more and more people with these problems that are connected to that PEPCK protein. It can account for all of those things, because you can't, and so you can't push fat. You can't take fats and turn them into sugar, which also means that the fats can build up, and that's why you get the fatty liver disease.
Wow. Are there other issues with detoxification you see from glyphosate? So we talked about how ultimately glyphosate can mess up the oxalates, which then dump out the sulfur. And sulfur is one of the most important amino acids that the liver needs to detoxify. We talked about how it messes up this other pathway, so the liver basically gets fatty. Are there other things it does with detoxification, the body's ability to detoxify?
Right. Well, there's one of the first things we identified, and that was in the first paper I wrote with Anthony, was the cytochrome P450 enzymes. Those are super important enzymes in the liver for detoxing many different toxic chemicals. And they get severely suppressed by glyphosate. That's been shown in animal studies. And of course, another cytochrome P450 enzyme is aromatase. And aromatase has been shown also to be suppressed by glyphosate. Aromatase converts testosterone into estrogen. And I suspect that aromatase deficiency is a factor in autism, that there's not enough estrogen in the brain because the brain can't convert testosterone to estrogen. And the estrogen is protective in the brain against neurological damage.
Yeah, and I mean, just thinking of this hormonally, some of the kids that I see have this very weird, aggressive tendency to them, which has to do with excess androgens. And there are these odd
Yes.
tests that I can run that indirectly measure androgens, and in some of the cases, those androgens are elevated.
And even women, right? PCOS I think, is becoming very common. And that's an excess androgen problem as well. And that can lead to infertility as well as different issues with the reproductive system for women, polycystic ovary syndrome.
It's tragic what's happening.
It is. It's absolutely unbelievable. And what I find frustrating is that it has taken us this long to figure this out. I mean, we've been Monsanto has done such a good job of suppressing the research, and even if the research gets done, suppressing its publication. I mean, they're very good at locking down the system so that the information can't get out to the general public. And they've managed to keep this chemical alive for 4 decades now, and it's more and more every year, and it's poisoning the entire planet. I mean, it's not just the humans that are being affected. It's all the plants, all the animals, the microbes in the soil. Even probably in the clouds. I suspect the cloud bacteria are getting harmed by glyphosate. And that's part of the reason why we have such strange weather these days with torrential rain and drought and all of these problems, excess heat. The cloud bacteria, I suspect, are able to moderate the weather patterns, and they're not working anymore.
Wow. Are there other things that you find in terms of our physiology that we haven't yet touched on that glyphosates would impact, especially when it comes to children with behavioral problems?
Well,
not that this isn't enough. I mean, most parents, their head is probably already spinning, and they're like, "Oh my God, like this is crazy."
I know. I mean, I think the hormones really, the neurotransmitters really get messed up because you have the serotonin deficiency, you have the dopamine excess if you've got the yeast overgrowth is going to cause, Clostridia overgrowth is going to cause these metabolites that block the clearance of dopamine. You also have vitamin A issues because vitamin A can become toxic because it doesn't get broken down. Normally, vitamin A would be removed by metabolized by the liver using cytochrome P450 enzymes, so that's messed up. Vitamin D is a problem because vitamin D activation requires cytochrome P450 enzymes in the liver and the kidney. So we have an epidemic in vitamin D deficiency, and I suspect a lot of it has to do with the suppression of the enzymes that activate it in the liver.
Wow.
And then there's also, there's a whole bunch of stuff about the sulfate, and actually quite interesting with respect to ammonia as well. And I think you mentioned ammonia in one of your email messages. That goes with the glutamate. It's really quite fascinating to me how all that works out. I actually think that there's a strategy to, because the glucose is so messed up, the insulin receptor is getting messed up. I suspect that's got glycine dependencies. It won't go to the membrane if the glycine is substituted by glyphosate. You can't, you get insulin, you get type 2 diabetes, basically. But you also get in the brain an inability to, so because of sugar, and for example, also I think maybe because of the hypoglycemia, and I'm making this up kind of as I go, but if you think about the unstable sugar, right, that you come into a crisis of low sugar, and you can't, gluconeogenesis is broken because of that PEPCK, your body can't afford, the really thing you cannot afford is for the brain not to have nutrition. And the brain really depends critically on sugar. So if sugar goes too low, the brain goes apeshit, right? It's like, oh my God, this is really, and so I suspect that the brain protects itself from that by accumulating glutamate. So you end up with a lot of excess glutamate in the brain. I think it's a protective defense that because glutamate can actually go into the citric acid cycle and produce ATP. It can replace glucose in the mitochondria.
Wow. And
so I think the brain thinks it's necessary in a sense to have all this extra glutamate on hand, because when the blood sugar goes low, the glutamate's going to be available to offer an alternative fuel choice. And of course, glutamate is neuroexcitotoxic. So your neurons are on fire because of that. They've got all this extra glutamate, and they don't know what to do with it. When they've got the sugar, the glutamate's, in the way, really. It's just going to cause trouble and cause stimulation, too much stimulation of the neurons. And the ammonia is also interesting. I did a whole paper on encephalopathy I did this before I knew about glyphosate substituting for glycine. But sort of a low-grade encephalopathy in the brain as being a feature of autism, sort of a swollen brain within the whole encephalopathy pattern. It includes high glutamate and ammonia. And then it's very interesting because the ammonia can actually substitute for taurine in the mitochondria as a buffer for the basic pH. The mitochondria have to have a very high pH. They want to be no acid, opposite of acid, very basic.
Yeah.
And ammonia and taurine are two very good molecules for buffering that high pH. So the ammonia comes into the brain and replaces, the ammonia would go with glutamate to make glutamine, but that's blocked because of the manganese problem. So you've got the glutamate and the ammonia in excess, and the ammonia goes and substitutes for the taurine that was buffering, but now isn't anymore. The taurine is released, and then the taurine can be turned into sulfate through a mechanism that might involve the gut microbes, because our own cells don't know how to turn taurine into sulfate, but the microbes can. And there's a whole process of the brain releasing the taurine, and then it goes to the liver takes it up, it hooks it to the bile acids, it ships it to the gut. All of this goes on in the body in response to, say, for example, seizures. So it's all connected to this mechanism to restore sulfate, because the brain is severely deficient in sulfate in association with autism, and probably these other diseases as well. So the taurine becomes sulfate with the help of the gut microbes. But that process also gets blocked by glyphosate. I found a paper that showed that E. coli, it was interesting because they had a whole bunch of proteins that were suppressed by glyphosate. But I think almost the highest ones were several different taurine transporters. So the E. coli can't bring the taurine in. They can't turn it into sulfate. And so that whole system breaks down as well.
It's scary.
It is. It's absolutely terrifying. I mean, I'm just absolutely obsessed, as you can tell, with this molecule. Yeah. It's incredibly fascinating, and I do like a puzzle, and this is like the mother of all puzzles.
Well, thank goodness that you're there doing this work and you're getting the information out there, because thanks to you and the work that you've done, the publications that you've had, the presentations you're doing, and I'll link to all of them on your MIT website, so the families can actually go and read your work themselves and watch the presentation. Okay. Thanks to you, we're finally becoming aware of what this compound is doing to us. And, it's because of all of your work that, one of the absolute rules I have for the families I work with is that the kids need to have as organic a diet as possible and as clean as a diet as possible, because nothing is going to work. Yes. I can do backward somersaults and I can do all of these different kinds of treatments. Nothing is going to work because their systems are getting mucked up at multiple different levels by this compound that's disabling them, really.
Absolutely. I certainly feel that way. And even, unfortunately, organic food is sometimes testing positive for glyphosate, much lower levels generally, but it's just so pervasive in our environment that you can't keep it out. I mean, they're not using it, but it's in the rain. It's in the soil. I mean, it's very, very difficult to avoid it. You really can't. In our country, you just can't avoid it. We've just poured so much of this stuff all over the earth, and it just breaks my heart to think of how much we're ruining this great planet that we live on. It's not even going to be livable if we keep this up.
What would you suggest for families to do to try to limit the glyphosate exposure? If you were in their shoes, what would you do?
The most important thing is the organic diet, and we're very strict about it in my family. When we shop, we pretty much never buy something if it's not certified organic, unless we know the farmer and the farmer assures us he's not using it. So really be very careful about certified organic when you shop. I think that can make a big difference. Water, you need to worry about the water. If you live in a place, especially if you're living near farmlands, you want to have your water tested for glyphosate. And reverse osmosis filter can remove it. It won't be removed by a standard carbon type filter. It won't remove the glyphosate. So it's hard to get it out of the water. It's a small molecule, and it goes through any kind of, anything that's trying to filter. it's going to get right through. So it's difficult to get it out of water. But reverse osmosis, which removes everything, unfortunately, so you lose the sulfur and all the minerals that are in the water when you do that. So you have to put those back if you use that reverse, because it's important to get those minerals that are in the water. It's quite frustrating that we have this water that's so contaminated. Luckily, they use chlorine or chlorine dioxide as treatment in the water treatment plant. So if you've got a municipal water supply, typically I think it's the case that they would be using chlorine or chlorine dioxide or ozone to kill the bacteria in the water to prepare it. And it turns out those things all break down glyphosate non-enzymatically. I was really happy to hear that, because I think that means there's a lot less in our water than there would otherwise be because of those practices. It's fortunate. I recommend fulvic acid and humic acid as supplements. It's been, studies on cows have shown that the fulvic acid and the humic acid bind to the glyphosate. I actually think it's possible that there are enzymes. There are these enzymes in the fulvic acid that are very sophisticated enzymes that can break down lots of things. And so I'm suspecting, and there's even papers that suggest that that's the case, that these enzymes can break down glyphosate. There aren't many enzymes that break it down because it's a very difficult molecule to it has a particularly difficult bond in it, a CP bond it's called. But there are some microbes that have enzymes that can break it down. In particular, I found Acidobacter is one of the microbes that are capable of metabolizing glyphosate. And those are found in probiotics like apple cider vinegar and sauerkraut and
interesting.
So fermented food. So I think that's a really good reason to be eating those foods on a regular basis.
Beautiful. Other things that you would suggest for families to do to protect their child?
One thing I recommend is sunlight, a lot of sunlight exposure to the skin and to the eyes. And that is to help your body produce sulfate. I have a theory that the cells in the skin produce sulfate in response to sunlight. And also in the pineal gland, which is sitting right behind the eyes. So if you're looking outside in the bright sun, the sunlight goes in and reaches the pineal gland and allows the pineal gland to make sulfate. At night, it hooks the sulfate to the melatonin molecules and ships them out into the cerebrospinal fluid. So that's supplying sulfate to the neurons to help them clear the garbage.
Wow. This is amazing. Thank you. I can't thank you enough. I know you're extremely busy, and the fact that you took this time out to share with us your work and just all of the things that you have found and how it's impacting these poor children, I'm so grateful for.
Well, I'm really glad at the work you're doing too, because you help to point the way, to show me that I'm on the right track. When I figure something out and you confirm that it's actually happening, it gives me confidence that I'm right about this. I mean, a frustration of mine is that this idea of glycine substitution is being vehemently denied by the industry. And it's being so well denied that chemists are believing that it's not possible. So we're in a situation where something that I believe is so obviously happening that there's no question. Almost everybody else who's an expert is saying, no, it can't happen, forget it. They won't even look to see if it's happening. And that's been a frustration of mine, because I want the chemists to do the experiments. Monsanto themselves have done some experiments that are very convincing to me that it's happening. They haven't published these experiments, but Anthony Samsel has gotten a hold of these papers where they've really shown that it goes into the tissues and accumulates in a way that you can't see it. So like they did a study on bluegill sunfish, and they exposed them to radio-labeled glyphosate so they could see the radio label. And they looked at the tissues, and they found the radio label in the tissues. But when they measured for the glyphosate, they only got 20% recovered of the radio label. 80% was unaccounted for. Then they got the brilliant idea of adding enzymes that break proteins down into individual amino acids. That's really crucial, because the glyphosate was embedded in the protein chain, and then you don't see it as a glyphosate molecule. Once you chop it up into individual amino acids, they were able to recover up to 70%. So they got a lot more, 50% more, still 30% missing, which means still 30% tied up in those proteins, because glyphosate makes the proteins very difficult to break down.
Wow. Well, thank you for the work you're doing. I keep it up. We need more, and hopefully we'll reach a day when we become smarter about what this compound is doing to us.
And I'm really glad that you're aware of it now, and you can help to spread the word among your collaborators and other practitioners to help people other people become aware and learn how to deal with all these issues and fix these problems. It's really awesome. So I
Thank
love
you.
what you're doing, and thank you so
Thank you.
much for that.
Thank you. It's needed. It's needed.
It
In
certainly
this
is,
time
absolutely.
of need.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you all for listening. This is Dr. K from Holistic Minds. And again, I thank Dr. Stephanie Seneff for the time that she is taking to share her wisdom with us.
Thank you.
So
Thank you
much.
for having me. Mm-hmm.